Hello, everyone. Thank you very much, Olga, for your very kind introduction, which I understood thanks to our wonderful interpreter. And thank you to the European University at St. Petersburg for inviting me. It's a great pleasure to be in St. Petersburg. It's my first proper time here. We spent some of the afternoon on the subway, which was quite an experience for us, because our subways aren't anything like your subways. Okay, so as Olga pointed out, I'm going to start my lecture by talking about public space and some sort of general theories around public space and how we think about public space. And then I'll move on to a particular research project that I've been involved with in the last year or so, which is specifically about water. So it'll sort of be about half and half in that way. So obviously you are interested in public space, or you wouldn't be here, but I'd like to suggest that public space has been incredibly important to urban theorists, and I think what characterises the public realm obviously is its distinctiveness from the private and domestic sphere, though the boundaries between the two are always shifting over time and space. Typically the public space is where strangers encounter one another in different areas of the city, piazzas, parks and squares and streets and so on. And from my point of view, what is more interesting is the informal and liminal spaces of the city, and that's something that I've worked on a lot and I'll talk a little bit about. So these are places like city allotments where people grow vegetables, skateboard parks, street markets, and some of these less visible spaces of the city are what interests me, the less formal ones, the significance of those in constituting multiple publics in the city. I'm just going to go through some of the schools of thought briefly and traditions that can be identified. And famously, Hannah Arendt, whose work you may be familiar with, thinks about the public realm as the space of politics, where people go to debate their ideas and where people enter as equals who don't bring their differences with them. So this is a kind of undifferentiated subject, undifferentiated by class and gender and race. This is kind of the Athenian agora, that kind of public space, which translates into the notion of the city piazza. Then we have Habermas, who proposed a similarly idealistic notion of the public realm as a space of rational debate and communication, though in that case he didn't exclude the notion of different identities entering into that space or distinctions of class. So for him it was the coffee houses and the cafes of the late 19th century that represented the public spaces that were significant. Now, both these perspectives have for quite a long time come under criticism, particularly from feminists, who argue that this is the notion of a public realm which excludes women, and I'll come back to that idea in a while. The third body of literatures derives from the work of anthropologist Clifford Geertz and sociologist Erving Goffman. And in this, it's the notion of a kind of performativity that takes place in public space. This describes the way in which people express themselves in public, such as through their clothes, their customs, their rituals, their ways of eating and drinking and greeting one another, and observing when and where people meet as strangers or make contact with one another. So this is the idea that differences in public discussion can be, as it were, and public address and behaviour cut across and disrupt social and cultural divisions. Now, Richard Sennett, whose work you may know, drew very heavily on these kinds of thoughts, these kinds of ideas, to stress the idea of boundaries and the uses of disorder between communities as the crucial spaces in which the public might be established. So he's very keen on the notion of dramatizing difference through encounter in the spaces of the city, which he argues gets closed down by the kinds of architectures and urban infrastructures that are prevalent. And here I'm just going to show you this kind of picture, which you'd be familiar with, a very formal kind of public space, not one which is the kind of spaces where differences can, as it were, perform themselves. It writes those out. And these are kind of firm, hard boundaries that a lot of modern architecture has been rather kind of partial towards. So in this, the buildings are kind of over-determined in their specifications, and a kind of architecture that doesn't plan for change or flexibility. Instead, he argues for buildings that should be incomplete and technologies which can change and open up spaces of encounter against the prevailing trend towards the privatization of space through cars and so on, the sort of loss of dedicated public space. Now there's a tradition that goes back right to the 60s to somebody called Jane Jacobs, whose work you may have also read, which is wonderful if you haven't, where she talks about the value of the street as very important to city culture, to vibrant city culture. Those are some of the traditions that have been important, but also there's a long history dating back through the 20th century. Jörg Simmel particularly was influential. In their formulation, he uses the formulation of the mask of rationality, and he talks about the idea of indifference between urban dwellers, a mask that people adopt to protect themselves from too much going on, too much stimulation. So you sort of cut off so that you can get away from all this stimulation. And then also, of course, even earlier, we have Benjamin's talk, writing of the urban flaneur who moves through the city spaces, the cosmopolitan spaces, absorbing the spectacle, enjoying the commodities, enjoying that sort of vibrancy of the early arcades. So also we have De Certo and the notion of everyday spatial practices, the idea of walking in the streets, developing, as it were, your own movement through the city and making it your own. More recently, there's been a tradition, and I suppose I'd sort of situate my own work in that, which is the notion of the public city being about an openness to what Iris Young calls unassimilated otherness, the commingling of strangers. I'll come back to that picture, the one just before, but just the kind of way in which people, as it were, rub along in the city. And here it's the notion of mundanity that I'm interested in, the everyday, the way in which people just mix. You don't have to necessarily speak. It's not necessarily about public debate. It's not necessarily about rationality. It's just about those daily encounters in the city. And this is where we think perhaps more about less visible places, those places where people rub along together, their bodies embodied in space, and as it were, passing by one another. And this is why I got interested in street markets and just really kind of regular spaces of the city where people enjoy each other. And these embodied spaces enact all sorts of transnational connections. I think this is particularly the case with markets, where the sounds and smells of the markets and different food and commodities, the different types of music playing on the radios, and the intimacies of body movements of the shoppers and traders. So I did some work in Brixton, in this market here, which is, if you haven't been there, if you come to London, go to Brixton Market. It's, you know, you could feel like you're in Lagos, or you could be in anywhere in the world, but probably you wouldn't think necessarily you were in London at all. So I've been interested in markets for the point that they actually bring people together in these different kinds of ways. They bring bodies together in space. Rubbing along is the term that I like to think about there. Now, along with these positive, if you like, optimistic accounts of public space, there's been also quite a long tradition which has been rather pessimistic. And again, Richard Sennett actually talks, I mean, he's kind of interesting, his work, because it crosses both a kind of optimistic notion of the city and also a rather pessimistic one. But in his early work, The Fall of Public Man, which is a book that still, you know, is worth having a look at, he describes the loss of public space in the city, the creation of dead space, like I showed you in those early pictures, this sort of dead space which lacks any atmosphere or vibrancy. And these kinds of spaces here, which have been so popular in some cities, raising difference, and how this kind of poor planning and architecture, particularly of the post-war period, but I think you'd see a lot of that in a lot of the kind of modernist Soviet architecture too, where they were sort of hollowed out, the cities were hollowed out and made to be centres for cars. And more recently, another strand of thinking about privatization of public space, the militarization of public space, as places become less and less accessible. Just famously, the benches that homeless people, they make them so that people can't sleep on them. They make them roll top and and the whole sort of shift towards neoliberalization of cities and private investments, where shopping centres come to dominate the spaces, where people are kept out if they don't look like the right people. If you're a young person, or if you're the wrong race, you'll be kept out of these places where there's a lot of surveillance. A lot of public spaces become like that, or it's become thematized, Disney parks and so on. So there's these different kinds of tensions in public space, from a kind of the sense of public space as a space of rubbing along and difference, and for me those would be the much more liminal spaces, the much more unusual spaces, if you like, that are worth thinking about as public space, and then those more kind of flattened out dead spaces, which have been very popular with the grand planning of cities, the grand sort of architecture of cities. You have this kind of tension in cities. And then just briefly, I think Olga mentioned I've had an interest in thinking about the city from the perspective of women. And again, there'd be many critiques by feminists about the way in which the city is kind of designed to kind of in some senses exclude women, or rather not to be responsive to women's particular needs. And that would be women as mothers with their kids, with their strollers and so on. That would be older people who might be scared of being in the city because they're empty spaces where there's no sort of lighting. There's all sorts of ways in which the city can act to reinforce sort of gender inequalities, and that's another kind of take on the city about public space that I think's important, and we can take that up perhaps more in question time. Now, it's clear from this brief journey through a diversity of different ways of thinking about the city that there are many ways of thinking about public space, the public city, public realm, and been theorised from many different perspectives, which have led to all sorts of fabulous studies all over the world. Much of the scholarship has focused on Western cities, but there's also significant contributions which consider public space in the global south. Sether Lowe, for example, has built up a considerable body of work on the public spaces of Central and South America, using a conceptual model which emphasises the co-production of urban space, where professional designers, funders and builders' ideas that shape the environment are contested, and spaces are appropriated by users and residents, who rarely share the same intentions as those that have defined them. Many anthropologists have explored the use of street markets and how they mobilise multiple publics, and this is something I'm interested in, the shoppers and the traders and so on, all using those spaces in different ways. And then the way in which, in different cultures, I love this picture, but when I went to China, I loved seeing the way people use these public spaces of the city. Just you put down your mahjong and you play on the bench. You turn a small space into a public space by just performing in it, and this is very important. And so public space shifts and changes over time and space. It means different things to different people, and it's embedded, I think, in relations of power, class, ethnicity and gender. So that's a really big sweep through a lot of a different theory. Now, the most recent shift in thinking on the public city has emerged with the material turn, with the kind of STS thinking that has become much more prevalent. And this is, I'd say that although some attention was paid to urban form and the design of cities and how this affected public space, in much of the discussion, the public realm, the public space, the notion of the public was very much dematerialized. It really had no physical substance or solidity. Now, on the one hand, you have architects and planners who thought about city very much in a kind of design-oriented way. But in terms of theory, especially coming from social theorists and so on, it was almost like public space had no materiality. And in, I guess, the last 10 or 15 years, as many of you are aware, the social sciences have been influenced by theorists who've theorized a non-human and material world. Now, obviously, important here is Bruno Latour, who some of you are familiar with, whose actor network theory has been particularly important in this new way about thinking about space. And here, this kind of framework makes no distinction between the various actors involved in the analysis, human or non-human, individuals or organisation, the social or the material. So in this kind of account, each should be analysed in equivalent terms using similar principles. So here, A&T, in terms of public space, considers how the circulation, movement and translation of material objects, instruments and technologies serve to produce a durable pattern of relations or network. And this network stabilises the identities of different actors, who may be human or non-human, creating particular kind of social worlds, and in the kind of context of our talk tonight, creating a particular kind of urban realm and public space. Now, as you'd probably be aware, Antti Theory questions assumed status of categories like science, society and nature, or the social, since the makeup of these entities can't be assumed in advance because they mutually co-produce each other. So the public city and public space in this account is constituted by human and non-human actors, and the role of material objects is thus important. So in Latour's exploration of Paris as an invisible city, he and Hennant sought to make visible the heterogeneous array of objects, networks and relations that make up the city of Paris, showing how objects anticipate and format the behaviours of humans by authorising or prohibiting, promising or patterning or permitting. So we had a project, Olga and myself and some colleagues, looking at the mundane objects in the city and thinking about how they work to pattern and shape, if you like, different kinds of behaviours. This was the bike rack. I think maybe you took this picture in Amsterdam. And we were thinking about things like bollards. How do these kinds of objects that we run into every day permit, authorise, prohibit, promise certain kinds of behaviours? Bollards prohibit cars from driving on the pavement. Tree protectors allow cyclists to chain up their bicycles and protect tree bark from damage, for example. So objects do these things, and they inhabit cities. These objects inhabit cities in multiple but standardised forms that we encounter every day and just don't think about often. This method's been adopted by many urban theorists to consider how objects in the city format experience of the city, afford possibilities, and transport the action given to them by humans across time and space. Another person who's been influential in urban thinking on the city is Jane Bennett, an American philosopher, who explores how material objects can do things, can make a difference, produce effects and modify other entities, recognizing that all of these possibilities cannot be deduced in advance, but only through the performance of the object. In these kinds of accounts, the public realm and the publics who inhabit public space cannot be thought of as distinct from the material world. Rather, they have a co-constitutive relationship with it. Ash Amin develops these ideas in the notion of lively infrastructure, which is a concept that our colleagues at the European University of St. Petersburg are working with, which focuses on the symbolic power and affective and aesthetic qualities of urban infrastructure. So it's clear that there's many different perspectives on public space in the city, and that's sort of my kind of introduction, I suppose, my first half of the paper to you. I want to move on now to the work that I've done on water. Some of the work I've done on water. Okay, I sort of started noticing water in cities. In various ways, really, but it suddenly kind of took my attention. This is often what happens with the research I do. I sort of suddenly start to. It's okay. Am I going too fast for you? Fine. Okay. So I want to now in my talk about how, or rather explore how water's powers in everyday public space summons up new alliances, new connections, publics, discourses, and practices in defining social and material worlds. I want to investigate the different ways in which water has the capacity to produce strong attachments across a multiplicity of publics, to mobilise fear and discourses of risk, and engage engineers in practices which destabilise normative conceptions of the traditional engineer. I'll turn back to, I think I've got a slide where it just summarises what I'm going to do now. Here we go. So these are the categories. Through doing the research, I kind of came up with these categories of what water actually does, what water has a capacity to do, has capacities to do all sorts of different things. But I sort of organised my thoughts, if you like, around these kinds of notions, which seem to kind of work. I'd love to just quote you this, which is at the beginning of my paper, but it's I love James Joyce. I don't know if any of you read James Joyce, but there's a wonderful bit where he says, in Ulysses, what in water did Bloom admire? Its universality, its democratic equality and constancy to its nature in seeking its own level, the simplicity of its composition, 2 constituent parts of hydrogen with 1 constituent part of oxygen, its healing virtues, its docility in working hydraulic mill wheels, turbines, dynamos, electric power stations, bleach works, tanneries, Scotch mills. I have no idea what Scotch mills are. But it goes on and on like this, and it's just a lovely piece of work, of writing, I think. So water's acted as a key protagonist in public space for as long as cities have existed. I don't have to tell you about baths, I don't think, here in Russia, but from the baths of the Roman era to the municipal fountains of Victorian cities, water's exerted a strong presence in the urban landscape, and baths, I think, in particular, have represented a space of embodied pleasures in public, though their publicness has been somewhat limited and demarcated into spaces specifically built for that purpose, rather than integrated into the fabric of everyday outdoor public space in the city. But we can see that water thus has the capacity to enrol bodies, not just in the more familiar terrain of the domestic arena, but in communal bathing spaces of the city also. And also, from the origin of cities, fountains have been constructed across the world to celebrate and publicly establish local or national figures on the one hand, or to consolidate city power on the other. I did some work on fountains and sort of wrote a paper about it, but it's fascinating really how central fountains have been to many cities and how they come to represent different things in different cities. But of all the European cities, I suppose Rome and Paris are best known for their fountains, where the power of the church and the state is materialised into public water features, such as the fountains of Versailles. There's a great book by Mukherjee on Versailles on this, or the Four Rivers Fountain in Piazza Navona. But with the occasional subversive immersion of lively publics, or drunk publics in the case of England, into on New Year's Eve, for example, or hot summer's day, into the Trafalgar Square fountain, which is the favourite activity of British people on New Year's Eve, whip off their clothes and jump into the fountain. Really, fountains have largely been objects of the public gaze, rather than sites of active engagement. Now, the thing I came to notice, this is what sort of started me to be interested in, is that there's been a dramatic transformation in the last decade or more, as urban fountains have increasingly shifted from being these formal, highly designed and sculptured water artifacts to their incorporation in public spaces designed specifically to engage and involve multiple publics, constituting new spaces, I would argue, of publicness. Well, finally, a hybrid space between these bodies of water in the city are public ponds and lakes, where swimming is permitted on a formal or informal basis. Again, in London, we have the Serpentine, which has been a swimming place for a long time. And more recently, there's all these new beaches that have been constructed along the Seine in Paris and the Strandberg Tegla Sea in near Berlin. But despite the ubiquity of water in the city, it's been very much ignored by urbanists in public space, curiously. And I think this is sort of what drew me to it. It's a sort of overlooked player, if you like, in everyday public space. There's quite a lot of work done on urban water infrastructures and the hydraulics of water, but not as a kind of active player in public space. That's what I came to be interested in. So the paper draws on two case studies, and one of them is this... where are we? I'm just keeping an eye on the time. I had it before, so I'm going back. There we are. So one of them is Bradford. This is a town in the city in the north of England, Yorkshire. And the other space I'm going to look at is St Ponds in London, in Hampstead Heath, which is a big public park. I don't know if any of you have been to these places. They came to my attention in the first case through reading the press, the Bradford Pool, and in the second case because I live near them, the ponds. And they sparked my interest as contested sites of water in public space that appeared to have assembled heterogeneous publics in complex networks of support and resistance. So in this sense, to me, they demonstrated that there were sites where water demonstrated its capacity to summon new alliances, connections, publics, discourses, and practices in defining social and material worlds. Initial investigation revealed these three things: that water seemed to mobilize fear and discourses of risk. It engaged engineers in practices which destabilized normative conceptions of the traditional engineer, and it produced strong attachment. My concern, therefore, was to explore the different ways in which water in public space, a material that is rarely seen as an actor and whose presence in public space is often taken for granted, has the capacity or had the capacity to actively constitute social and material worlds, assembling publics in intriguing ways. And I was particularly interested in engineers imbricated in the process, and colleague Hannah here and her colleague, also a friend, got me interested in engineers through their own study of roads, which was great. So I was interested in the kind of discourses, practices, engagements and attachments that were produced once water seemed to matter. So these are two very different sites. They tell a very different story. This Bradford pool is really interesting. Basically, this was a city in the north of England which suffered from very significant deindustrialization at a time when the industry of the city went into decline, and it was left in a very difficult sort of situation. A lot of unemployment, a lot of dissension, it's a very mixed city racially. It was very much in decline. And what was fascinating was that the urban regeneration people in this city decided that what they were going to do was turn the city around through water. It was really a very kind of powerful decision made on the part of the regeneration department. This was a city that had been dependent on the wool and the brewery industries, which had both used water from the river, but the idea was to bring water back into the city. So this was a space before this came into being what it was. That's there, the town hall, and it was surrounded. Basically, you kind of walked out of the town hall, and what you had was a big road complex with cars whizzing round, and a sort of I haven't got a picture of it, but a very, very desolate, horrible city centre that people never went to. So this regeneration officer said, "Okay, what we're going to do is we're going to make a huge pool. This is really very large. I don't know if you can get the scale of it, but it's very large, and it's sort of a little bit reminds me of the I don't know if any of you have been to Siena, but the wonderful piazza in Siena, which is a really great public space. I mean, the Italians were very quick to get good public spaces into their cities, I think. But so we're going to take it and basically build this great thing. So they took out all the roads. They moved everything from the centre, all the transport, right back. There's no roads here at all, and built this pool, which was very shallow. And she managed to get it through council, which was really quite extraordinary. A lot of fights, people said, this is crazy, you can't put water into the middle of Bradford. And she said, yes, I can. And she got herself involved with this building this thing. And this is what it looks like on a sunny day. I mean, it's really quite bizarre. People go along and they put their towels out, they take their clothes off. Some days they have like 2,000 or 3,000 people there. It's the most extraordinary public space. And what it's done is changed the city. It's completely changed the city. And it's given the city a new image. It's kind of created an enormous attachment. I mean, this is my point about attachments. The publics that use it are diverse. It's popular with women. It's popular with different ethnic and racial people from different ethnicities and backgrounds, and it's very successful. The second space I want to discuss is Hampstead Heath. Now, Hampstead Heath is, it's a fascinating, completely different. It's a lovely place in the middle of London, which is a big piece of public land, which managed to be saved from development back in the 19th century by parks legislation. And a very, very popular place with a series of ponds that have been fed by a natural river. And this is one of the ponds. Each pond has a different identity. So there's a women's pond. I showed you a picture of that earlier, where only women can swim. Here it is. It's too far back. There. Was that? Sorry, that was the picture. It's a very, very popular place for women, and it's the nicest. The women's pond's the nicest of the ponds. The next nicest pond is the men-only pond, and then the least nicest is the mixed pond, which I think is quite funny. So there's all these ponds fed by water, and then there's the duck pond, there's the angler's pond, there's the dog pond. They all have different identities, and people fiercely love this place. They just love it. So into this space came this intervention. So I'm going to now just talk about the intervention. The intervention took place as a result of an act that had been enacted in Parliament, which defined reservoirs as bodies of water of a particular size. And the Reservoir Act said that if you have an amount of water in the city or anywhere that's bigger than whatever it is, I forget now, but if you have a certain amount of water, let me tell you, I can't remember what it is, Reservoirs Act, it's, anything over 10,000 cubic metres, perhaps people understand these, has to be investigated. So suddenly these pieces of water, which had been there for hundreds of years, that everyone had sort of done all these things with and been engaged with, they were suddenly defined as reservoirs. And once they were defined as reservoirs, they called in engineers, and water engineers, had to work out whether these were safe or not. It was all about safety and it was all about risk. This was the concern. So they did. They got these hydraulic engineers in. It's a long story, but the kind of, you don't really need the detail. But the point was they did the study and they found that there was danger. They were suddenly defined as risky, and they were defined as risky because they in this particular. I don't know if any of you are hydraulic engineers, but they have a concept called probable maximum flood, which means that at a certain point a flood will take place. If there's a rainfall on this body of water at a certain level, you'll have a flood. Now the likelihood of this would be a large storm, as it were, above these ponds. So it wouldn't just be any old storm, it would have to be above the ponds. And the likelihood of this would be 1 in 400,000. Now, that's not a big number, 1 in 400,000. If this happened, it would lead to a catastrophe. Supposedly, the water would tumble away from all these ponds and it would go down into London and flood London. Now, this was a sort of hydraulic engineering model, which represented a sort of idealized and abstract notion of mathematical properties of this particular space. It was a figure which, the precision of this figure, 1 in 400,000, became, as it were, the red rag to the bull in the whole contested space that emerged. But it was something that became the signifier. It became, that very figure, if you like, became the actor in the events which followed. What happened was the Corporation of London, who owned this space, basically decided they were going to build dams. And they were going to build dams at a huge cost. They were going to, as it were, rebuild this space. And unfolded after this was about 3 or 4 years where there was a massive fight between the local people and the Corporation of London. Quite an interesting local group, actually, because the people who live in this area are pretty bolshy. Do you know the word bolshy? Stroppy? Tricky, difficult people who are like not going to lie down. So everybody got together in these big groups, and they basically, they have lots of lawyers and actors and all sorts of people. It's quite a bohemian area. Tried to fight the Corporation of London. Well, you can imagine what it was like. Anyway, it went on and on and on. I went to some of the meetings. Anyway, they lost. To cut a long story short, they lost. We, the people, lost, and the corporation got to build their dams. Now, these dams are ridiculous. I mean, they have practically reconstituted the whole of this space, having defined it as a risk. So that's a longer story I can tell you. But so this is risk. And I think it's kind of interesting because risk was also mobilised in the Bradford pool example. One of the ways in which the people who resisted, the people in the council resisted the idea of this pool, again, it was risk. The idea is water's risky. In the case of Hampstead, water's risky and it's going to kill half of London when it floods. In the case of Bradford, people were going to slip. There was this idea that if you have water makes slippery surfaces, and slippery surfaces are dangerous, so we mustn't have slippery surfaces. So what they did was they very cleverly managed to find all sorts of granites and stones and things like that could be used on that surface so that there wasn't going to be any slipping. So this was the idea. Water's risky. We can't play with water. So I've explained to you about the idea of attachment. I've talked to you about the way in which people get very passionate about these spaces. And the last thing I just want to say before I wind up was I developed this idea that water softens engineers. I don't know if Hannah likes this idea that water softens engineers, but I think it's quite interesting because the stereotypical, what does water do to engineers? How are they shaped through their entanglements with water and public space? And how are they transformed in the process? And I think this is pretty interesting, actually. I went and interviewed a lot of engineers and went to their meetings and so on. And what I found was that there was a kind of new breed of engineer being mobilised and engaging in water. On the one hand, this whole growth of water features in the city, these fountains, these places like the Bradford Mirror Hall, but there's all sorts of these fountains which you see all over London now, and quite a lot of cities. I don't know if you have them here, but where the water, what I didn't tell you about the Bradford pool is that the water dances and it plays and it does things. It's very active, the water. It doesn't just sit there as a pool. During the day starts in Bradford with mist, so the water makes mist. So as you're going to work, you have mist. And then later on, it starts to dance and it starts to play. And then as the day goes on, it does different things and different rhythms. And all this is created by a very sophisticated hidden digital world. Underneath this seemingly, nice space, you can find a very, very complicated computer that I went to see, where all the programs are set to make these things happen. There's many, many fountains like this in London now. They're all run by digitally, and the machine is often hidden. somewhere else to make this happen. And the water does complicated things. It dances, it plays, the lights blend in with the movement and so on. These are places where people go and spend time, and they feel very engaged because the water's active, it's making things happen. So I interviewed the people from these hydraulic engineers, and what I discovered was that they were actively engaged with artists. There was this really interesting coalition of engineers and artists who were working together to create these spaces. So suddenly they didn't see water anymore as these fountains that I talked about at the beginning, these kind of formal type of fountains, or in honour of anybody, or memorialising anybody, or embodying state power. They saw them as places to play, and they saw them as aesthetic. And they saw, well, of course, fountains are always aesthetic, but they saw them as places to engage multiple publics, and particularly children and women and so on. So I found that they were passionate, actually. The people I interviewed were absolutely passionate about water. And these engineers spoke with a bit like the way James Joyce spoke about water. I could read you some quotes, but perhaps we haven't really got time. But they all talked very much about what water feels like to them. They seemed to be very affected by the water they were working in. In this country we are indoctrinated to feel scared of water. Don't go near the ponds, don't do this. I think it's so wrong, fundamentally wrong. Water's about life, isn't it? So I was determined to make water friendly and fun and invite people to interact with it. And no one would ever get poisoned from our fountains. They won't drown in them. That was one of the engineers. And all of them just spoke very lyrically about the water with which they were engaged. I've got lots of quotes to that effect. And then it was very interesting about the men building the dams, because this is what it looks like at the moment. It just looks hideous. The whole of this beautiful, that's where one of the swimming ponds was. But again, interviewing the engineers and going and having discussions with them, it was fascinating, because what they said was they had never worked in an environment where they had to interact with anybody. The engineering projects, this is a big firm called BAM. Normally what they do is they have high fences and they keep the public out. They keep the public away. But here, because it was in a place where there were these passionate attachments, where there'd been all these fights, they were being forced, they were being turned into, if you like, I said, soften engineers, because they had to engage with the public. So there were all sorts of requirements they'd never faced before. They had to walk before the lorries. They couldn't have the lorry just coming through the ground. They had to have little vehicles going before them to make the passage possible. They had to engage with publics on the ground. So in each case, there was a lot of understanding that water had changed the nature of the engineering practice of those involved with it in quite significant ways. So I found this very interesting, how it had enrolled different kinds of actors in different kinds of ways into different kinds of behaviour and practices. So I mean, that's kind of where I'm at really with it. But I guess I'm kind of interested in following this on in different ways, thinking about water and what it does to make publics, to what it does to make cities, to what it does to change the way we are co-constituted and co-produced in public space with objects, with materialities, with, in this case, water. That's where I'll finish.
В то время как Софи рассказывала про веселую, играющую воду как фан, да, я думала о другой истории, которую описала в своей книге «Future of Nostalgia», «Будущее ностальгии», Светлана Боем. Она написала об одном кёнигсбергском немце, который приехал в город Калининград, вышел на берег главной реки Пригони, которую он помнил еще с детства, опустился на колени, зачерпнул воды, умылся ей и у него началась страшная аллергия. Потому что была вода настолько загрязнена химикатами из местного целлюлозно-бумажного завода, что даже просто касаться ее было очень опасно. Вода представляет из себя неустойчивую субстанцию, неустойчивую материю. А вот как ею пользоваться в городе, как из нее сделать полезный для публики материал, об этом как раз говорила Софи Уотсон, и об этом вы можете найти материалы на нашей выставке. Софи упомянула в своем рассказе, когда она говорила о латуре, о том, что вода тоже может стать агентом, вода тоже может стать действующим лицом в общественном пространстве. Вот один из проектов, показанных на выставке, морской орган в Хорватии, на берегу моря, где вода используется в трубах, спрятанных в ступени, идущие к морю, и производит звук, производит музыку. Вода используется для того, чтобы изменить не только визуальность, не только видимый ландшафт, но еще и звуковой публичного пространства. Я думаю, что у вас, наверное, накопилось много вопросов, и вы горите желанием задать их нашему спикеру Софи Уотсон. У меня микрофон, если вы поднимете руку, то я микрофон вам передам, и вы сможете задать вопрос. Вопрос можете задавать как на русском, так и на английском языке. Наш переводчик Евгений все доставит Софи.
Thank you so much for your talk. It was really inspiring to think about water in such a way. But I have a question about the really difference that make water in the city. For instance, if you're talking about this London and in like British cities, I remember when I've been there in the inner yard of Victoria and Albert Museum, they had some like fountain and lawn. And what I've noticed is this, like the activity on the lawn is actually mirrored somehow in the water. So that means that this is not a separate like space, but they are connected. So they mirrored each other. And in this sense, I have a question: what make the water really different in the city? Because it seems like it's really contribute more to the activity that happened without water. And the same, for instance, for Russian cities when we have fountains, but it's prohibited, for instance, to swim, to walk there, and the same for the squares. You know, you can walk in a very you can't make some special activities because it's prohibited. So in this sense, the squares and fountains in the square, they also somehow interconnected with each other. So I really tried to figure out how we can find out how water make the space different.
Okay. I think what I was trying to talk about, because I've gone very quickly over a lot of stuff, is a shift in the last decade or so. So the kinds of water spaces you're talking about are the more traditional ones. What's happened in the last 10 years is that these new spaces of water are enrolling bodies quite literally into those spaces. So the distinction, there's no boundary. It's a bit in the Richard Sennett sense of no boundaries, no borders. There's no distinction between the edge of those spaces, like the Bradford Pool. There's no edge as such. The edge changes all the time. The boundary keeps shifting. And in those spaces, there's an active co-constitution of playfulness and bodies and so on, so people can walk through them. The way that the water, they are fascinating to look at digitally because they are, it's only enabled really, it's only possible now because of computerization, because of digitalization. So that the surprise way water behaves, because it goes up and down, because it dances, because it stops, quite often it just stops. So, for example, they're usually pretty much flat. They're sort of shaped a bit like that. So it contains the Bradford one's about that deep. Some of them are shaped sort of like a base, and some of them are pretty much flat. But you can walk through them. There's no water at all. It just goes down, and then it'll start to dance. It literally dances. It bounces like this, and so people are really excited. It's very exciting, especially for children, but it's actually quite exciting for everybody. So what happens is people dance around, and then what happens is people watch. So you get this whole way in which there's a real engagement with these spaces. They're not separate, actually. They're not even interconnected. They are themselves, as it were, summoning up different kinds of practices from the one you're talking about at Victoria and Albert. Very often they're in regenerated spaces. As a tourist, you might not even see them. They've been very significant in regenerating space. For example, like there's one behind King's Cross in London, which is a big railway station, which was also a very run-down area. And part of the regeneration was to put one of these in there. You suddenly find that an empty space becomes full, in the way that those early dead spaces I was showing you become empty. They become empty because the wind goes through them, because they're dead space. These are the opposite to that. They're very lively spaces because there's movement, there's light, there's playfulness, there's water's doing something. And that means that bodies and people are enrolled and summoned into those spaces and connecting with each other in different ways. So they really are completely different from the way in which fountains were before. And the connection between that and the digital city is fascinating, because actually it's quite expensive, to run these are quite expensive. The computer behind the scenes, as it were, that's doing all this, and they can set them to different kinds of patterns and rhythms every day. They're not the same. They're never the same. So it's quite distinctive. It's a very distinctive new formation of watery spaces, if you like, I think.
То есть получается, что появился за последние 10 лет новый тренд в создании общественных публичных мест и их оживления, в котором задействована вода. И вода вовлекает публику и заставляет людей собираться и действовать. Да? Это становится точкой притяжения и точкой привлечения. Вот бы нам такое вот в Петербурге.
I have a question about another aspect to this materiality of water in the city, because there's, I believe there's a series of various water features that were erected in Moscow for a couple of summers now, and this is also a growing trend here, where children can run through, and they're not quite fountains, they're quite shallow, right, like you're describing, and then of course you have all the children who want to go there and flock there, and all the parents who are saying this is not sanitary, this is disgusting, and if you look at the kinds of chemicals they put in there, it's got little bubbles on the side, and this is actually not just something I've seen in Russia, but in other places where people begin to engage with these pools. So there's also the other kind of materiality, which is not just playful, but there's a concern for public health, there's a concern for the chemicals that are in there. How do you keep this space as sanitary, especially if you have kind of this mixing and mingling? So I wonder if you encountered these things in your research.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. One of the risk discourses, which I didn't go into, was precisely that. The first one it happened with was one called the Princess Diana Memorial Fountain. It was in Kensington Gardens. It was quite interesting because they hadn't worked out how to treat the water such that it wouldn't grow moss. So it grew moss, and then of course people slipped, and so then it became a real problem. So actually, as far as I understand it from talking to the water engineers, they can now produce water that is very safe in terms of pollution. I don't know what they put in it. It's not highly chemical. And most of them are emptied at night, and so they can clean the whole area out so that it's not going to gather pollutants. So yes, it's been a discourse of concern, definitely, but it seems to be one that they've managed to resist. I find it quite surprising, actually. I mean, in the context of sort of health and safety being such a dominant way in which public spaces have been erased of difference and so on, actually, it's been quite successfully dealt with. But certainly it's there. It's certainly an issue that people were concerned about. But not anymore. They don't seem to be. The water's all gone by the end of the day. So presumably under the ground, in fact, I do know this, under the ground the water gets cleaned at night and then comes out again in the morning. So I think they've got a sort of system in place in all of them. So it's not a concern.
Мне кажется, очень интересно, как вот в рассказе Софи переплетается вопрос риска, вопрос безопасности, общественной гигиены, с одной стороны, и вопрос беспорядка. Когда наш спикер начинала свою лекцию, она говорила о том, как Ричард Сеннет, в общем-то, видит беспорядок в городе как позитивный, необходимый, нужный этому городу момент. Но с другой стороны, инженеры говорят нам о риске наводнения, а медики говорят о риске здоровью общественности. У кого еще есть вопросы?
Any other questions? I'd like to respond to Olga, what she just said. I mean, I think, from what I understand it, this really ties in with the kind of rise of the risk society, you know, the whole kind of Beck notion of risk society. I think there's a real tension in public space precisely on the grounds of risk and trying to, you know, that has really had terribly negative effects, in my view, in relation to public space. I mean, another one that's very common is the one about children going to school. You know, it used to be the case that children walk to school, now they don't because it's seen as unsafe. Why is it unsafe? I mean, it's crazy. You get a kind of circular thing because when you've got fewer people on the streets, this is what Jane Jacobs said, wasn't it? When you've got fewer people on the streets, there's more risk. There's not people the eyes of the street are not there. When you have people on the street, it's a safe place when you've got lots of people keeping an eye on each other. So risk, as it were, is a kind of circular argument. Once you create risk, you stop people doing things, then it becomes more so-called unsafe. It's like discourses of paedophilia. I don't believe there's any more paedophiles now than there ever were, but you know, it's in the public realm. So then everyone says, "Oh, I can't let my child out on their own. It's not going to be safe." You know, so I think risk is a very big part of the story that we're telling in a way about public space, and it has to be resisted because I think it mobilizes inaction, actually, inertia. Risk mobilizes inertia in general, I would say.
Совершенно верно. Мне кажется, что у нас в Петербурге есть другого типа фетиш, да, это установка заборов, шлагбаумов и камер наблюдения для обеспечения безопасности общественных мест, для обеспечения безопасности жителей жилых кварталов. Откуда эта боязнь берется, как она генерируется и как она воспроизводится, вот какой отличный вопрос для какого-нибудь хорошего исследования.
Thanks again for the lecture. I got two questions. One is very brief. Am I right that Bradford has no river very near to this city? That's why this initiative was very popular with a pool in the center of the city. Am I right or not?
No, you're wrong. Bradford means, I don't know, in Roman times. The ford actually is another word for water in England. So it was the crossing of the water in some form or other. And the river was very important to the industry because both the wool, which was very important industry there, and the brewery making beer, both those need water. So actually the concept of water was really important, and it was the memory and the nostalgia for that, I think, that made it possible to argue for this being in the centre of the city. I think it was drawing on cultural memories of the importance and significance of water. So that's kind of interesting as well, I think.
Yeah.
As you know, many cities are built on rivers or seas. I mean, water has always been significant in cities in terms of where they've been placed.
Yes, it is very interesting, and it's connected with my second question. I really doubt how to discern or how to separate. Let's do this. How to separate water from infrastructure that arrange water and make it water for people, because this water is very specific, is safe. It is has special chemical structure. It has the bottom of pool, they are not slippery, and it's not very deep and so on. So it's created so that to make people, to organize, to make fun, just because to be safe and safety and so on. So it's like that. It's not water. It's a special water. It's special infrastructure for water. For example, we know water from another sewer system and so on that is, for example, dangerous and so on. So we need a special water, special arrangement of water. But for me, I got a methodological question: how to separate water from the infrastructure of making it. Does it could be done?
Well, I think water comes in so many different forms. I mean, the contrast between the two places I looked at, those ponds, of which are 6 or so ponds, well, there's more, but anyway, they're fed by a river. And they historically, they're not manufactured at all, actually. They've been there for... Originally, they were obviously not in the form that they were, because the form has changed, but that's wild water. And in fact, they're very muddy. And ducks swim in them, so they're dirty as well. And but people love them. I love them. I swim in the women's pond. You know, my daughter goes, "Oh, that's so disgusting! How could you possibly swim there with all that duck shit and things?" You know, and you can't see the bottom. But we like that. You see, those of us that swim there like it. So there's a range of, I suppose, possibilities for water. Which I mean, I've talked about two very different ones. One would be almost, you could say, wild water, and then some would be manufactured. I don't think water's one thing. Water's so many different things, and there was a different discourse of risk about those ponds before these engineers came in. The discourse of risk there was about swimming in cold water. I know in Russia people swim in cold water, but in England they got very worried about cold water being dangerous because it would give people heart attacks. So they tried to introduce legislation about 10 years ago to stop cold water swimming because they said it's dangerous. And then it became a really interesting discussion about who takes responsibility for your own body. Like, can the old people swimming there, some of whom were like 90, they live forever when they swim in this cold water, as far as I can see. They were like, we can decide if we want to have a heart attack or not. You know, don't tell us about where we swim. And the Corporation of London was going, no, it's really dangerous. And then they had a commission. They had another report written by health experts who said it's really not safe to swim in cold water. You know, and then they came to Russia and they found all these Russians did swim in cold water and it was okay. So I mean, so risk comes in different forms, you know, and water comes in different forms. I think this is the kind of interesting thing to, as it were, look at the ways in which these discourses get mobilized. So does that sort of answer your question?
Возвращает меня в мою память наш вечер открытия, когда выступал Алекс Доминез из Барселоны, и ему был задан вопрос о том, ну вот как же вот беспорядочное публичное пространство, там же толкутся все, кому не лень, и шумно, и пахнет, и как же с этим жить, да? Ну вот тут вот оказывается, что кто-то любит плавать в чистой воде, кто-то любит плавать в воде с утиными отходами, Кто-то любит плавать в теплой воде, кто-то в холодной воде. Должен быть какой-то уровень толерантности. И эта толерантность, наверное, и есть то, что создает множественные публики. Нет одного городского общества, одного городского сообщества, они все многочисленные, да? Они все плюралистичные. И это тот момент, который мне очень нравится, очень симпатичен в работах Софи Уотсон. Не ассимилированные, не интегрированные, самые разнообразные публики, которые город может поддерживать через свое публичное пространство. Мне бы хотелось поблагодарить Софи Уотсон за ее рассказ сегодня вечером. Спасибо большое, Софи.
Thank you, I've enjoyed it.